Suzanne, we're going to start with you. Go right ahead.
Okay. I also have some slides, which maybe Dave can put up. This is the first one. On May 31st, a few days ago, I guess it was now, in New York, we pulled off a real major project. We filed signatures to get Diane Sare on the ballot as a LaRouche independent candidate for the U.S. Senate. She would be opposing Senator Chuck Schumer, who has been one of the major forces for over 40 years in the Senate and has played a critical role in every war the U.S. has been involved in and is known as the senator from Wall Street. What you see here is a crowd of people, citizens, Americans who petitioned to get Diane on the ballot. They moved into the Board of Elections. There was cheering, there was photos taken and so forth, because what they had accomplished was thought to be impossible by people who were restructuring elections in the United States in maybe a similar way to what Claudia was talking about restructuring government to allow certain kinds of financial controls. This is definitely the case, and that's what I want to show you, some of these slides to give you a picture of that. So the next one, these are the 29 volumes of petitions that we turned in over 6 weeks of collecting 45,000 plus signatures. We went considerably over. Next. And here they are processing these in the Board of Elections. Next. And here's Diane, who is our candidate, who obviously shows the mood having accomplished this event. So the next one. Now, why was this such a big deal? I mean, on the one hand, it's very important to have Diane on the ballot, but also this was done in the context of a major move in the state to deny access for candidates to be able to run. It is explicitly stated that changes in the election law, which were put into the budget, never actually debated in legislation, put in 2019, 2020, and again in 2020, 2021, were done in order to remove parties, independent parties, from the ballot by making conditions so difficult it was seen that people couldn't meet them, and similarly to keep independents off the ballot. So I'll just go through a few things to give you a picture of this fairly quickly. Next. This is the petition to run for office. You have to get these signatures. Next. The requirement used to be 15,000, and this is where the changes came in. How did it go from what was 15,000 signatures for an independent to get on the ballot? How did it triple? What happened? Go ahead. And here's the legislation where they took a red pen and wrote out 15,000 and they put in 45,000. One way it was done was simply by changing the rules. And this is a major move of oligarchical control. Whoever controls the rules controls the process. The explicit statement was that by changing the election rules, they could change the outcome. Next. And they set up a commission to do this, which they said had the power of law. Next. And they said, ironically, they were doing this because there was a perception of corruption of elections in New York State, which of course is absolutely true. And in order to end the corruption, they were going to set up a commission to allow electoral finance reform. And in the context of that, they said they had to throw people off the ballot. Next. Their contention that if they allowed what they called frivolous candidates, or candidates who did not have the support, did not have the ideological position of the majority of voters of the state of New York, that somehow they would drain a fund they were setting up to give matching funds to candidates. This was clearly debunked. It was simply not true. Next. But this is the statements that they were making, that they had a $100 million fund they were going to give to match contributions that would get the corruption out. But again, that this could not go to people they called frivolous or to candidates who did not reflect the novel and distinct ideological identities of the electorate of New Yorkers who ultimately fund this public campaign. Now, imagine a statement like that they could reject people based on that they said they didn't reflect the novel and distinct ideological identity of the electorate. Well, wait a second, isn't that what elections are supposed to determine? What's happening here? Go ahead. And so we launched a huge fight on this, not just saying we could accomplish this, we could get these signatures, which was an enormous challenge. It represented time, being in the snow, being in the rain. This was done all by volunteers throughout the state of New York. The people you saw who entered the Board of Elections there, they came from Buffalo, from Rochester, from the Bronx. They came from every place. They were citizens who were determined to say, we can nominate the candidates that we choose to vote for. And we asked the question, how can you talk about the right to vote if you deny candidates the right to be on the ballot by manipulating the rules? Go ahead. And this is a very critical question around elections in the US, because during the voting rights fight in 1965, this exactly was the situation where as part of the Voting Rights Bill passed in 1965, there was a section called Section 5, and they said, we know the way the system is rigged. You say in the amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment of the US Constitution after the Civil War, that African-American men had the right to vote. But what was then done was to say, yes, but we set the rules. And the white primaries, as they called them in Mississippi and in the South, said, sure, you have the right to vote, but we can change the rules. We can say you have to jump over the moon. You have the right, but you have to jump over the moon. You have to recite the Constitution backwards. Next slide. This was taken up in the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and it was set up explicitly that you couldn't change the rules without having an oversight of the Justice Department at that point. But this idea that that whoever makes the rules can create the results, this is exactly what was attacked by the Voting Rights Act, but this is an idea that they were reasserting, not just in changing the laws in New York State, but also in what's happening around the country around gerrymandering districts, which people have seen, these wild district maps where they say, well, we can determine which candidate will win based on how we draw these district lines. In New York State, this was so corrupt that it's gone through 3 sets of appeals. These district lines they drew, it still just recently was determined what the congressional districts are. You have people running for Congress and they don't even know what their district is. So this is part of, on the one hand, the attempt to say we can control who gets elected by changing the rules. And on the other hand, the fact that you really do have a question of whether the citizens have anything to say about this at all. Next. And this is really the question of the American system and whether or not you have an ability to have the citizens have any control whatsoever. Whether you have an oligarchy in which whoever sets the rules is in control, or whether you have the citizens themselves play a role. Now, one of the things that we kept have happening to us, our petitioners around the state, which was quite amazing, is we had people thanking us for petitioning, which seemed unusual, really. You don't normally think you're going to thank somebody who asks you to sign a petition. But the thing is, there's an incredible sense of frustration in the United States that people have lost control of the government, that it really has nothing to do with them anymore. And of course, there's good reason to think that. On the one hand, you have the government, the Biden administration, pouring out billions of dollars, 40 billion here, 30 billion there, sending advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. Nobody's asked the American public about that. And constitutionally, it's Congress's responsibility to declare war. During the escalation in Iraq, in Syria, Congress debated it. Should they go to war? It's their responsibility. Now they say nothing. Similarly, on the economic situation, we have a move around inflation. We met this where people were signing our petitions, people leaving grocery stores who had to leave food behind because they couldn't afford it. We had people reporting from certain areas in New York where they had grown up that the level of desperation, of homelessness, of drugs, even shocked people who had lived there for many years. The inflation is simply a form of taxation turned inward. People's life savings are being taken away from them. You might remember the term bail-in, which LaRouche talks about quite a bit, around a process where you're not bailing out the financial system, they're simply bailing in and taking people's life savings. Who has asked the American public anything about this? Nobody. And that's the reaction we were getting as we were gathering these petitions, both support for the idea that Diane was saying she had the right to be on the ballot, but also, are you going to reconnect the role of the citizen back to the control of the government or not? Next slide. Now, this is directly connected to a much larger shift that occurred with 9/11. And since then, with a series of moves, including the wars that the US has been involved in since the end of the Cold War, all based on an intelligence apparatus that simply lied and never had any repercussions of that. We saw it with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It goes on over and over, but how does it relate to the elections? Well, you might remember 2016, even before the election, the intelligence agencies were saying Russia was interfering in the US elections. This was never demonstrated. Over the next years, from 2016, 2017, Robert Mueller set up an investigation. There were investigations after investigations, all of which came to the conclusion that there was no proof that such a thing had occurred. But by accusing the Trump, at that point, just his candidacy, of dealing with foreign powers, with, that there's certain kinds of intelligence rules that went into effect. One is something called Executive Memorandum 12333. There's certain things that they used for a lot of the operations that were run against the Trump candidacy. This is a big part of it. Now, this slide in particular is an example of this. You might remember, if you think of the chronology, in January of 2016, Hillary Clinton was under big attack for her private server around the emails. Also, there was the later results where her emails were showing an attack on Bernie Sanders and an attempt to disrupt his campaign. By May, there were charges that those emails were released because of a Russian hack. And holy hell began to break loose about this question of the Russian role. The intelligence community, the same people that created Iraq and everything else, immediately clicked in by August, or maybe it was October, saying that there was absolute proof of Russian collusion. And this continued. This is a thing from Twitter, from Hillary Clinton, where she pushes this idea of Russian collusion. She says 4 things you need to know about the Trump Organization's secret server to communicate with the Russian Alpha Bank. And then it goes through charges of the Russian connection to Trump around this Alpha Bank. This was before the election. These kinds of things escalated in the following way. On the electoral side, what began to happen was a move to say the elections themselves were national security issues. That the FBI, the Homeland Security, all the 16 intelligence agencies were brought in to begin to control at a much higher level the U.S. electoral process altogether. And this particular Twitter is significant because this had to do with the escalating cases, which were just taken on by John Durham in a court case against a leading figure in the law firm Perkins Coie, which represented Clinton and the Democratic Party operation. This case just took place, and there was a decision May 31st, the same day we were filing our petitions. The decision incredibly backed, the Sussman in this, which I can go through in a little bit. But the point is that what is occurring here is a move to integrate in an actual perspective being run by the intelligence agencies and directly into London, now into the electoral process itself and the control of U.S. elections. Go ahead. In fact, you can see here, it's not really in focus, but in 2019, the Worldwide Threat Assessment Report came in, and the number 2 thing it lists here is the question of elections themselves as national security issues. Go ahead, the next one. Now, just to give you a sense of this, what happened with it is the intelligence agencies insisted that this collusion occurred. The Trump administration came in and began to hack away at the critical issues that the Anglo-American networks were pushing. They pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership almost immediately when Trump got in. In April, he pulled out of the Paris Accords and began to debunk the idea of global warming, which in the earlier national worldwide assessment reports was also said to be a national security issue, with the full support of the military apparatus pushing the climate change agenda. Trump was meeting with Xi Jinping. He was saying it was good to have peace with Russia. By September of that year, there were already calls for his removal, essays talking about a potential coup. And in 2018, the British House of Lords report came out and again put together this question of elections with their idea of control of the process in the US, where they actually issued a report saying that Trump himself had opposed the Anglo-American positions to such an extent that there had to be an assurance that he would not be reelected, nor anyone like him. This was 2018. Just to give you a sense of this, this is one of the players in this thing. His name is William Evanina, and he is Homeland Security. Homeland Security was intimately involved in this whole restructuring of elections. Because of the charge of collusion, they began to move into the state election boards and to insist that they had to be reorganized because of the threat of a Russian interference. This became so extreme that Charles Krebs, who was part of this counterintelligence operation in elections, was ultimately removed by Trump. But as he was going out, there were all these discussions about their intense meetings with the states, how this was unprecedented. Normally, the states did not work with the federal government around elections. Krebs actually talks about an hour-to-hour reporting system in the election in 2020, going directly into the intelligence agencies about what was happening on the ground. William Evanina was one of the key people on this. He's the head of counterintelligence and security. This picture is taken from a roundtable event, next slide, in which he said the following. He said, social media and the ability to promulgate information expediently on the web is going to be a big vulnerability for democracies going forward. He said during a conference hosted by none other than the cybersecurity company CrowdStrike, who you might remember was the company that was dealing with Hillary Clinton's servers when the question of the hacking occurred. He said, we have not succeeded across our democratic countries in explaining to our populace how important and how fragile our democracy is. The core fundamental basis of that fragility is free and open elections. Very interesting. The statement that the electoral process itself, were it to elect the wrong people, that this is a question of national security. He argued that the threats to democracy are more enduring than the impact of terrorism. And actually, in that worldwide threat report I showed you, there's a list of threats, including terrorism, and the question of elections and the need to control information is high up on that list. He said we have to do a better job of educating our voters and our populaces in our democratic countries why the threat to democracies through elections is an existential threat. Next slide. This event with CrowdStrike, which they held, as you can see here in October 2020, here you have Evanina here representing the U.S. Homeland Security. Above him is the president of CrowdStrike in the U.S., who also is ex-FBI and so forth. He had actually testified in one of the congressional hearings that there was no evidence of a Russian hack of those servers that CrowdStrike was involved in, but still they pushed this idea of Russian collusion. So that's who he is. And the guy on the left, bottom left, is a top defense security guy from London. And what they talked about in this discussion is the need to have tight control of both information by which the population might make a decision in an election, and then the electoral process itself, and that this is an international issue and also includes privatization of the election process itself. Next. So this all ties into what we're talking about, where on the one hand, you have something fairly simple, which is I want to run for office. You know, I want to be a candidate. You run into a buzzsaw of laws, rules, changes, the idea of which is to pre-select before you even get into the elections who is and who is not allowed to be a candidate. And that's fairly straightforward. So we did the impossible. We had citizens who insisted they had the right to have some control over the government process. That is, after all, the American system. And at the same time that occurred, you have this May 31st trial. On the left is John Durham, who you might remember was appointed special counsel as the Trump administration was going out of business, more or less. That has continued because he was special counsel, so that position did not dissolve. The guy on the right is Sussman, who was just prosecuted for lying to the FBI. He worked for Perkins Coie. He was having extensive meetings, bringing in all sorts of slanders. This included, in particular, the Alpha Bank report that Trump was working with them, which was later debunked. He got this stuff. He pushed it through the Clinton, he brought it in as part of the Clinton campaign, pushed it to the press, and then he held meetings with the FBI in which he pushed this so they would begin a bigger investigation of Trump with these charges of foreign collusion. There are check stubs. They actually billed, these people for their time in doing this. He was charged with lying to the FBI, saying he was not representing a political campaign or Clinton's campaign, that he was doing it just as a friendly gesture of interest. It was clearly the case that was a lie. However, on May 31st, he was found innocent. But the investigation continues. The media is saying it's over. Durham failed. Durham is now moving into the next step. But the question is, will he actually go after what we would go after, which is the involvement of British intelligence agencies in destroying the U.S., pulling the U.S. into wars we shouldn't be in, the ongoing destruction of the U.S. economy. And part of that is the fact that this law firm, Perkins Coie, involved in this, has been one of the most critical law firms in the reorganization of U.S. election law altogether. Next slide. This is the charge. Go on to the next one. And this is one of the key people in this. This is Mark Elias. He was the chief lawyer for Clinton. He was the one that hired Fusion, the firm that did all the investigations, coming up with this scandalous stuff, which wasn't true, which they then pushed to the press and to the intelligence agencies to disrupt the ability of the Trump administration to function. He also was the one who hired Christopher Steele, who was British intelligence, who wrote this report that they used against Trump. And you see here this headline, Perkins Coie, Mark Elias became every Democrat's favorite lawyer. Now he wants to reform democracy itself, which is true. I mean, he is involved in every critical law case in reorganizing election law all over the country, and they are in the process of doing this. There's a fight about it in many states, but the idea that if you can change the election law itself to determine who's a candidate, who isn't, what the outcome could be, this is really critical for people to be on top of. We ran into it when Dianne decided to run, but it's going on all over the country because, in fact, this is one of their critical forms of control. Next slide. And these are just some of the quotes from the trial, but they're interesting, but go ahead. This is what Elias says he's pushing. This is the guy talking about no excuse absentee voting, whether or not you need an ID, all these things which have their own relevance, but have nothing to do with what they're actually doing to manipulate elections and manipulate who is actually in control of policy in the country. Next. And, they model this on the old oligarchical principle, which Plato attacked in his Republic, which says justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. This is the position of Thrasymachus, which the American Revolution attacked. Next. And since it is the question of the Queen's Jubilee, and we are asserting in this that there is a critical difference between the American system and the British system. And if we don't actually go into that, you really lose perspective about how we're going to get out of this crisis. This appeals directly to the question of the role of citizens in elections. The preamble says that we, the people of the United States, to have a responsibility to promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And in that context, we created this government. The idea was, how do you promote the general welfare of not only yourself, but of posterity, of future generations? That's the responsibility of citizenship, to figure out how to do that, and the role of government. It's not always obvious. It's something that LaRouche has written extensively on in this question of relative potential population density. How can you actually judge whether the policies you implement are in the general welfare interest, not only now, but into the future? Next slide. And that responsibility of government, as the American Revolution adopted it, and the role of elections and the involvement of citizens in that process, is directly contrary to the British system, which is really the kind of thing Claudio was talking about Britannia and that concept of economics. Because here you have Adam Smith saying explicitly, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue as great as he can. He generally indeed neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. I mean, if you consider the difference between saying the general welfare is unknowable, it's better off if you don't think about it, just pursue your own gain. That's what they define as an economic policy, in contrast to the idea of the American Revolution idea of the general welfare, the question of government, and therefore the question of the citizens' role in that government. And then the last slide, I think, is Adam Smith wrote that in The Wealth of Nations. And in 1776, by the way, Alexander Hamilton responded, or said in his own right differently. He wrote about the creation of the wealth of a nation. And here he says, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. So that's the American system. The development and of the minds of the population and the ability of people to be productive. And the question of elections, how do you create the conditions in which those policies are debated and determined, is a critical one. And the attack on the electoral process, either by manipulating rules that you make up and then pushing this off into intelligence agencies, which think they can control it for their conception of the general welfare, or for the they call it national security. The British, again, it's, if you read the quote from the British House of Lords report in 2018, where they simply say, as the Queen might say, this administration, we simply can't have it. This is against the Anglo-American policy. We have to make sure such people are not elected. And, there's different ways that they have to do that.